Thank you all for taking the time to be here on a Tuesday afternoon. I really appreciate it. The title of this talk is Solitary. As I talk, there'll be Korean text projected. It's a little on the smaller end, so if any of you have difficulty reading it, feel free to come up and take a seat in the front.
연구에 와주셔서 감사합니다. 제가 오늘 하게 될 토크 제목은 솔리터리 보드이고요. 이제 자막이 프로젝션 돼서 보일 텐데 혹시 잘 작아서 안 보이시는 분들은 앞으로 와서 앉아주시면 좋겠습니다.
So with that said, I came to Korea to put myself in prison. This may sound a bit misleading, so let me start again. In 2013, a facility was built in the hills of Hongcheon, about an hour east of Seoul. On almost every side is a clear view of forest. The facility is run by an organization called Happatory, a combination of happiness and factory. Happatory caters to people who want to disengage from their busy daily lives and re-engage themselves. To this end, a total of 28 guests can check into its building, which is designed like a prison. Happatory offers retreats for teenagers, company employees, governmental officials, and the general public. Some sessions involve drama therapy, others are led by Buddhist monks. Most intriguing is a program called Solitary Confinement, where one can spend 24 hours of technology-free time locked in an individual cell. I learned about Happatory in 2014, and I've always wanted to visit. This past July, I finally had an opportunity. Over the course of this talk, I'll share some associations and reflections from the 24 hours I spent in solitary confinement. Central to Happatory's philosophy is the concept prison inside me. The idea is that each of us lives within certain restrictions. Some are self-imposed, some are not. Many are so habituated that they scarcely register in our conscious thought. Inside such strictures, we build a life. To these tight bindings, we accommodate ourselves. Seen through this lens, Happatory's prison-like facility is less an exceptional space, less a strange or quirky novelty in the relaxation industrial complex. Indeed, we don't enter prison when we arrive at Happatory. We realize, possibly for the first time, that we're already jailed. For the duration of our stay, we live inside ourselves, living inside a concretized version of ourselves. We're doubly imprisoned, trapped in a redundancy. Perhaps when a metaphor is this strained, it collapses under its weight. Perhaps by overdetermining prison, we can finally feel free. Freedom through restriction. It's something many people I know seek out in their leisure time. I think of the silent retreat, which my father has done several times in middle age. Over the course of the days, he recently told me, his thoughts become slower and slower, freed from the labor of transforming into speech. They could take a more comfortable pace. I think of the sensory deprivation tank, the anechoic chamber. There's a famous story about John Cage visiting one such chamber at Harvard. Surely, this would be among the world's quietest places, where silence might make itself known. Yet even inside the chamber, there was noise, the pulsations of Cage's nervous system, the rush of blood through his veins and arteries. These sounds accompany us throughout the world, but are dampened by the din of the world. Finally, they could be heard. Reflecting on this experience, Cage wrote, "Until I die, there will be sounds, and they will continue following my death. One need not fear about the future of music." In restricting ourselves, we free ourselves. A higher plane of awareness is reached. This trope appears in many cultures, often embodied in the figure of the blind. In losing an eye on the material world, the blind gains a view of the divine. During my time in Korea, I've become curious about another thematic of blindness. Blindness and filial piety, blindness and paternal devotion. A friend introduced me to the tale of Shin Chong, about a young woman working to support her blind father. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Early in one version of the story, Monk tells the father that if 300 socks of rice are offered to Buddha, he'll regain his eyesight. Unsurprisingly, the burden for obtaining the rice falls on Shin Chong, who sells herself as a sacrifice to the sea god, though lies to her father about the source of their windfall. The sacrifice takes a surprising turn. Touched by Shin Chong's circumstances, the sea god spares her life, returning her to land inside a lotus blossom. It opens at the touch of the king. He makes her his wife. Despite the offering to Buddha, Shin Chong's father hasn't reclaimed his vision. Compounding his woes, he comes to learn the truth of how she obtained the rice. He is now blind, and at least to his knowledge, he's bereaved. One day, all the blind people in the land are invited to a party at the palace, an attempt by the king to appease Shin Chong, who has been suffering from the absence of her father. When she reintroduces herself to her father, he says, "Let me look at your face." At that moment, he opens his eyes. His blindness is cured. Far more powerful than a spiritual offering, it would seem, is the worship of a father by his daughter. Only through her total devotion can miracles truly occur. If you can't hear the skepticism in my voice, please know it's there. Towards the end of Im Kwon-taek's 1993 film, Seupyeong-jae, the female protagonist Song-hwa trains to sing Shin Chong-ga, the tale of Shin Chong as told through the art of Pansori. The timing could not be more appropriate, nor more devastating, as her adoptive father and Pansori teacher, Yubong, has recently, secretly, blinded her with a concoction of arcanite. Song-hwa is shown practicing Shin Chong-ga in the mountains, shouting at the bleak of winter. In one of the pivotal scenes of the film, Yu Bong admits what he did. The reason, he says in so many words, is that one cannot truly express grief in pansori without experiencing it firsthand. Songwell's devotion to him, her lifelong commitment to her craft, could never be enough. Like Shin Chong, she had to be sacrificed. Even though it happened without her knowledge or consent, Songwell's blinding was the only way, in his mind, for her to sing the suffering of Shin Chong. The senses don't hold equal sway. Our ears and nostrils may lack lids, but they have far less appetite than our eyes. In being so reliant on sight, as philosophers like to remind, we risk being trapped by the world of appearances, taking what is evident to the eyes as tantamount to truth. For the blind, does another sense assume the predominance of vision, or do they all share the spoils? I don't know, but I like something Diderot has written, that in blindness the skin becomes a giant canvas upon which the world figures itself. Borges became blind in later life, ironically around the time he assumed the directorship of the National Library in Buenos Aires. So many books, and barely a pair of eyes to read them. In writing about his condition, Borges dispels the common conception of blindness as darkness. The blind do not peer into the void, he argues, so much as through a greenish or bluish mist, vaguely luminous. Living in the shadow of the visual world, colors and effects persist. A few weeks ago, I read Junichiro Tanazaki's In Praise of Shadows on the recommendation of my boyfriend. I was surprised by the tone of the text. Given its title, I expected a spare meditation on Japanese aesthetics, not a bitchy piece of design commentary that opens with several pages devoted to the toilet. Tanazaki's taste skews traditional, and he admits often outside his budget. His perfect bathroom would include a wooden urinal filled with boughs of cedar, its fixtures finished in glistening black lacquered. To eat food under electric light, he writes, is to effectively destroy it. The title of Tanazaki's book comes from his discussion of the home. Whereas the Western home is built with a small roof and glass windows to let in as much light as possible, the Japanese home lacks glass and needs a roof sized like a parasol to keep out rain and wind. In such a home, shadows collect. They patina the alcove and corners as if fleshing out hollowed skins, forming a quality of mystery and depth, Tanizaki writes, superior to that of any wall painting or ornament. My boyfriend was born in Shanghai, but spent much of his childhood in Tokyo due to his father's job. He visited me last month, and on our first afternoon together, we went to Gyeonggi-gung Palace. The palace, like several others in Seoul, is a composite that appears to be a seamless whole. Burned, dismantled, torn asunder, it's been partially made anew. A plaque installed on the site traces its greatest damage to the period between 1910 and 1945. If one could read the seam lines, they tell a story of colonialism. As we walked around the palace grounds, I told my boyfriend that I had finished In Praise of Shadows, fully expecting to earn some points. He sheepishly confessed that he had never actually read it. I admit I was shocked. I guess I had assumed that in recommending the book, he was offering a window onto his youth in Japan and his particular aesthetic sensibility. How would I describe that sensibility? Well, once when we were walking through Donald Judd's former Soho apartment, we came upon a thin, threadbare mat where the sculptor would take his naps. I watched my boyfriend make a mental note. In the home he imagines we'll eventually share, there'll be a single large table for eating, working, and fucking. 1 week before my boyfriend came to Seoul, I read Escape to Prison, a recent book about prison tourism. As part of his fieldwork, author Michael Welch visited the Sodaemun Prison History Hall, a museum built into one of the most notorious jails of the Japanese colonial era. Its displays include mugshots, artifacts, and the extremely unusual shadow image experiment, where a visitor can have their body scanned as a silhouette, which is then embedded in a video on a nearby screen. Over the next 90 seconds, the silhouette undergoes incarceration, interrogation, and torture at the hands of animated Japanese officers. One becomes familiar with the atrocities committed in this place by seeing one's very own shadow suffer. 2 weeks after my boyfriend left Seoul, I visited the museum to experience the shadow image experiment myself. But in its place, I found a video marking the 100th anniversary of the March 1st independence movement. A wall text encouraged visitors, as they watched, to shout, "Long live Korea." I know, I'm digressing. I'm here to talk about my time in a happiness factory designed as a prison. Sure, there are things to tell you. 3 times a day, a Tupperware meal arrived outside my cell, which I could collect through a slot in the door. At 9:30 p.m., I heard an officer checking the logs. In the hours that followed, the facility approached a painful degree of silence, which was interrupted only once by evidence of a contraband smartphone. Morning began at 6 a.m. with a soothing tone played through a ceiling speaker. A woman's voice, run through the mill of post-production echo effects, guided me in meditation. She finished, and I fell back asleep. When I awoke again, I wasn't certain if I had heard her voice or dreamt it. Very little can be brought into the cell. Toiletries and pajamas are allowed, but certainly no electronics, not even books. Every person is a book, an officer remarked, suggesting that one will have all the reading material needed to pass these 24 hours. Inside my cell, I found bedding, a yoga mat, an electric kettle, and a tea set. On a small table sat a pack of markers, a notebook, a notepad, and envelopes. The notebook contained reflections by past residents of the cell. All the entries were anonymous, giving power to this object, a collective portrait of solitary confinement, even if the writers were likely motivated by discretion. The notepad could be used for letters to family, friends, even oneself. Habitori's officers will take sealed envelopes and ensure they reach their intended destinations. By providing these supplies, whether intentionally or not, Habitori taps into the history of prison writing, following in the footsteps of as varied a group of individuals as Oscar Wilde, Antonio Gramsci, and Shin Chong. For many, writing materials weren't readily available. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. penned his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail in the margins and between the ads of the newspaper, on any paper towels and napkins he could find. King's lawyer and speechwriter would visit him twice a day, stashing the scraps between the buttonholes of his shirt. In 2013, Behrouz Boochani fled a journalistic crackdown in Iran, only to find himself indefinitely detained on Manus Island. Fearful that his writing paper would be searched and seized, he typed his memoir over a series of WhatsApp messages to his translator. It's bitterly ironic that though Boochani is still unable to enter Australia, the memoir, No Friend But the Mountains, won the country's 2019 Victorian Prize for Literature. Then there's the case of Hugo Grotius, a Dutch jurist. Jailed in the 17th century, he didn't smuggle out writing so much as smuggle himself out of prison in a bookcase. Kim Dae-jung once famously remarked, "I wish I could go back to prison, yearning for the time that incarceration afforded to read and write." Freedom through restriction. There's that theme again. It was only when imprisoned that Marco Polo narrated his travels to an inmate who happened to be a writer. Only then that the Marquis de Sade experienced his most prolific periods. Though it's worth mentioning that Sade spent about a third of his life in jail. Prison is even a template for writers who never went to jail. Annie Dillard found the view through her office window so distracting that she moved her desk to face a blank wall. Appealing workplaces are to be avoided, she reflects. One wants a room with no view, so imagination can meet memory in the dark. I lied to you earlier when I apologized for digressing. I wasn't sorry, and in fact, I hadn't digressed at all. Everything I've said and will say to you was drafted during my period of solitary confinement, in this order: the blind, the shadow, my boyfriend, are facets of the experience, thoughts that pass the time. It would be disingenuous to call this writing process liberating, to claim to have felt freed through the restrictions, because I'm acutely aware that Habitori's prison is a voluntary retreat. It's a privilege for a person like me to enter this prison. I can exit at any time by pressing a panic button in my cell. This is not to say that I doubt the sincerity of the facility's founders. One of them, Miss No, has done drama therapy with actual prisoners and other marginalized communities for much of her working life. Miss No believes the prison system can only do so much. Rehabilitation requires more than time in jail. As a testament to this belief, she recently held a session at Habitori for juvenile offenders and their families, a wrenching attempt to look beyond the symptoms. When Habitori first opened in 2013, the main program it offered was Prison Inside me. The founders soon came to realize that this name scared off potential clients. Prison inside me was thus rebranded with terms like happy reflection, softening a metaphor still unavoidable in the facility's architecture. Shortly after the imprisonment of Bak Geun-ye, Hapatori reintroduced the word prison with a new program, 20 hours in prison to change ourselves and our society. The timing expressed the urgency, even for a wellness facility, of reflecting on the state of the country and its elected leaders. To what extent, the title seems to ask, is her guilt our own? Have we become complacent about the political status quo? I don't mean to include myself in this we. Though Hapatori has received a fair amount of Western press, its website is only in Korean, so it doesn't actively target foreigners. Nor can I appreciate the nuances of how this mock prison operates within the Korean imaginary. My solitary confinement and this talk are just the beginning of my work. Going forward, I hope to find the means for colleagues in Korea to produce their own writing in Hapatori's solitary confinement, chronicling their reflections and associations, the thoughts that pass the time. I'd like these texts to come together as a book, and whenever it's published, I hope you'll take the time to read it. Thank you.